Working all right? Okay, great. Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be with you and great to be back in Pennsylvania. So I was born on the western side of the state. You know, those hillbillies, Pennsylvania people over there, that's kind of the world of my childhood. Spent my teen years there, and my ancestors go back about 250 years in that part of the state, as well as West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. So it's always fun to get back to this part of the country. I don't get to be here as much as I'd like. And I want to talk to you tonight about a theme or a subject that I've thought a lot about, written about, and to give you a little backstory on why I think about it and why I care about it. The title is Against the Recreational Household, and I'll be making a case for the productive household tonight. But I didn't find myself in a productive household or even a recreational household or even something that remotely resembled a healthy household as a kid. My father was an academic. He was at the University of Buffalo and then went on to be employed by Washington U in St. Louis. And during those years, this is the 1960s, I'm older than I look. But during those years, everybody was seeking, but nobody was really interested in looking in the right place. Everybody was into what I call ABC, anything but Christianity. And so my folks got into all kinds of stuff, the Baha'is, and eventually ended up in Scientology when I was about 6 years old or so. So I spent my childhood in that world, and it's everything you've heard. It's maybe even worse. And so I kind of experienced the weirdness of that as a kid. And I was converted, actually, in western Pennsylvania, and I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be a comic book artist. And I've got extended family who are artists, so that's one of the reasons we're so weird. You know, artists are kind of weird. You know that, Evan, right? You know. Anyway, but all of that kind of craziness in terms of my childhood. So I spent a lot of time in bohemian environments. But I have this kind of Norman Rockwell kind of thread that runs through my life as well. So I kind of got to see what, kind of the wacko sort of experimental left is all about really early. But I always had this kind of I guess, conviction that the stuff that Norman Rockwell painted was really the good life. And if you're not familiar with Norman Rockwell, he's an illustrator and he made covers for the Saturday Evening Post and stuff. But anyway, when it came time for me to establish a household, my wife and I, after were married, I didn't really have much to work with in terms of personal experience and role models. Although I did find myself in a little blue-collar evangelical church, and that's where I came to the Lord, came to faith, and I had some great guys that I could admire in that setting and kind of surrogate fathers. But I wanted to go a little deeper, wanted to explore the history of the household in the West, and that's what I did a lot of work in graduate school and so forth on. I remember one of the graduate schools I was at, I said, I kind of started off with this idea that if I could explore the concept of duty, the idea that sometimes the right thing isn't necessarily the thing you want to do, but you should do it anyway. What a radical concept, right? And so duty was the thing I was interested in. And in the course of my studies, I stumbled on Aeneas and the ancient understanding of pietus or pius, and very different than what it's come to mean for us, what the English word that we use for it today is piety. Very different way of thinking in antiquity, particularly in Rome, but also in Israel and in Greece. So that's kind of the background for you, in case you have read my book or are familiar with The Household and the War for the Cosmos. That's where that all came from. But anyway, because of that interest, I read Aristotle and Xenophon and many other writers who reflected upon the character and the nature of the ancient household. And it was basically the understanding of how households worked and the way we should think about them right up until the Industrial Revolution. So I want to get into that a little bit with you, because even though this might seem a little odd in terms of what I have to say, it's the way our ancestors lived forever up until about 150 years ago. Everything changed then. So the world that we live in is the exception, not the rule. The rule is what I want to talk to you about. So once upon a time, the economy lived at home, and households were for work. And the people who lived in them were put to work. There were family farms, of course. You've seen Little House on the Prairie, of course, and people working together to farm, and they were engaged in subsistence farming. And fathers led the way, and wives and children and grandparents and even hired hands all pitched in. There's a marvelous film, Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. Familiar with that film? If you haven't seen it, you really ought to see it. By the way, it's the basis for The Magnificent Seven, the American cowboy film, which is kind of weird because Kurosawa based the film Seven Samurai on American cowboy films. Anyway, so everything works together. But anyway, at the end of the film, when the bandits are defeated and the work of the samurai is done, the whole village is back to work in the rice paddies, and men are beating out time on drums, and everybody's singing, and everybody's working together. The women in the community are rhythmically shoving seedlings into the muck, and all the kids are toting and fetching. It's a marvelous picture of the way things used to work, but don't work anymore like that. So anyway, that I think is something that if you haven't had a chance to see that film, it'd be good for you to see. But it wasn't just farmers who worked at home. Bakers, smiths, cobblers, they all had their storefronts with workshops in the back. And upstairs was for sleeping and eating and playing and all those things we now call family time. But you were with your family. There we go. I hear myself now. Anyway, so things we now refer to as family. You ever see The Hiding Place, the Corrie ten Boom story? Marvelous film, but that film really does put on display how things worked. Even in the 1930s and 40s, the ten Booms. The father was a watchmaker, if I remember correctly, or he had a shop, and the shop was in the back, and then the storefront was in the front, and they lived upstairs. That's the way it worked. If you go to old towns, even here in Pennsylvania, and you're on Main Street, you'll see there are spaces above the storefronts that used to be residences. The people who lived in those spaces were the people who worked downstairs back in the day. Today, I imagine much of it is just storage. Anyway, so all those things demonstrate that it wasn't all work, but work was at the heart of what made a family. And there were the rhythms of the day and of the week, and one day in 7 was set aside for going to God's house, and offerings were brought in, and God's children sat down at his table to eat spiritual food. So there was the house of the Lord, and then there were our houses. And there was a kind of rhythm. We go to the Lord's house one day a week. We're in our house the rest of the week. So it wasn't heaven on earth, of course. There are lots of stories that we have about wicked stepmothers and tyrannical fathers and all that stuff that, constitutes sin. And sin, isn't just, something we have to deal with in our time. They dealt with it back then, too. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that they had some things going for them that we've lost. It's not all been kind of, gains when it comes to the history of the West. Many things to be grateful for when it comes to the way we do things today, but we've lost some things. We've lost some important things. So in the beginning, it was all in the house, the whole economy. Now, I use the word economy very deliberately because the English word economy is based on 2 Greek words. And those words are oikos and nomos. Oikos and nomos. Oikos is the Greek word for house. And nomos is the Greek word for law. So the law of the house is what an economy was. Isn't that interesting? We've taken a word, and now we use it in a way that doesn't seem to resemble anything like what it once referred to. But I'd like to take you back into the world in which the word was coined. So today, the economy doesn't even live at home. Gross domestic product, there's an interesting term. GDP, gross domestic product. The middle word, domestic. It's based on the Latin domus, which means house. You ever think about that? It's where we get a lot of other interesting words like dominion, domination. It's kind of a bad use of the term. And of course, domestic. And domicile, right? But when we use the term gross domestic product, we never even think about houses anymore. But once upon a time, everybody would have, in their mind, gone right to that. So today, we almost have nothing for households to do. Everything is done in the workplace. You wake up in the morning, you get ready to go to work. You go to the workplace, and in that place, you do your work, and then you come home, and then you recreate, so that you can get all sort of rested to go back to the workplace. But that's not the way it used to work. Now, throughout the world, in both the East and the West, by the way, there's some fascinating things you can discover by looking at the architecture in Rome and in ancient China. The houses have a great deal in common. They're built with kind of the same ideals in mind, particularly when it comes to the patricians or people who are aristocrats in China. Usually it's a quadrangle, and there is a kind of public face to the house, which is the side that faces the street, and that's where the father during the day would conduct his work, do his work there, unless he was having to go out and meet with other people, other places, or he was engaged in some kind of political sort of work as a leading citizen. And so people would come to the house and meet him there. But the house, it had a courtyard usually, and that courtyard was open to the heavens in both the East and the West on purpose. Because the idea was that a household was in some sense a reflection of a larger household, a larger reality, sort of like a field office, kind of based on the main office. By the way, that's the way sort of the tabernacle in the wilderness was understood as well. It's a miniature version of the heavenly court. Everything about it was intended to reflect the heavenly court. So you got these really interesting connections that are being made. Now, throughout the world, households were also religious institutions. Pagan households, of course, served the gods, and connecting the houses to the gods were the ancestors. So your ancestors were in a kind of large kind of structure, a heavenly structure, and that structure was hierarchical in character. The closer it was to the earth, the lower it was in the, this particular level was in the hierarchy. And it was like a ladder that, took you all the way to the top. And that's why, particularly in antiquity, in both the East and the West, the founding father of a household would often have his face cast at death, and his face would be placed right over the hearth, so you always knew he was watching. Here's great-great-great-great-great-granddad. He's watching. He's wanting to make sure that you guys are paying, your respects to him, but also that, behaving yourselves. Now, Christians had more in common with their neighbors than you might suppose. There's the fifth commandment, of course, honor your father and mother. But every role in the Christian household, in antiquity, in the classical world, was viewed through the lens of the Christian faith. And you see this in household codes. So we never read the household codes because they're politically incorrect. By the way, if there's something in the Bible that's politically incorrect, that probably means it's really important. And we should read it and try to understand it on its own terms and not try to read kind of the contemporary gloss and misinterpretation into it. So let's read Colossians chapter 3, verses 18 through chapter 4, verse 1, and I'll show you what I mean. So it says here in that passage, this is, of course, Paul, "Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged." Notice it keeps coming back to the father. So there's the father, there's the wife, there's the father, there's the children. Or you can say, so there's this kind of back and forth. Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Again, the Lord's brought into this. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that that from the Lord you will receive an inheritance as your reward. Isn't it interesting? He uses the term inheritance. By the way, that's indicative of how people think. And by the way, the theme of this conference, what we're talking about doesn't make any sense except within the framework of inheritance. But going on, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive your inheritance. For you are serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there's no partiality. And now, masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you have a master in heaven. So the Father isn't the very top. He's more like middle management, and I'll get to that in a minute. Now, this brings me to the biblical teaching on the nature or the origin of the household. There was a guy named Freud. I don't know if that name rings a bell, Sigmund Freud. He's not as popular as he used to be, which for good reason. I'm glad for that. But he represented a way of thinking about households that I think still kind of is with us, and it's the idea that when we address our Father in heaven, we're sort of projecting into heaven kind of our fears and our longings for security, and we're calling God Father because it's something that's familiar to us. But it actually works the exact opposite way. It's the other way around. Fathers are projected into the world. I want to show you some evidence for that. There's Ephesians chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, which read, "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named." For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, Heavenly Father, from whom every family in heaven and earth is named. Now, you've heard the term, something was lost in translation. That's definitely the case with this verse. Something is lost in translation because there's some wordplay in Greek that we can't appreciate, but I'm going to fill you in on what is going on. So, the Greek word for father is patera. Patera. And it's the basis for the Greek word for family, which is patria, which meant in Greek, you can't say family without saying father. Let that sink in. You can't say family without saying father in Greek. Now the wordplay makes sense. Let's go back and read the verse again. "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, patera, for whom every family, patria, is named." In other words, every family, in some sense, reflects the fatherhood of God in the person of the Father. So God's the one who's doing the projecting. He's saying, I got something that you need to know, and this is the character that's supposed to help you learn it. Whether he does a good job or not is another story, but this is how it's supposed to work. So, by the way, the word patria is where we get the word patriotism, right? Love for the fatherland. It's where we get the word patriarchy. Everybody's against that. Great. Ooh, bad word. Ooh. Bad. It basically just means the rule of a father. Believe me, having been a father and I, kind of got some, experience when it comes to fatherhood, there are times when your kids really want you to rule. Like when one of the kids is beating up on the other kid. Dad, rule. Step in here, establish some order, that kind of thing. Anyway, and then patrimony. Patrimony, we don't use that word anymore, but it just simply means the inheritance you receive from your father. There's a patrimony. There's something you receive from your father, an inheritance. We prefer the word inheritance now because it's gender neutral, but patrimony is the older word. So it isn't human beings who project a father into heaven. Instead, it's a heavenly Father who projects fathers and families down to earth. Now, as a practical matter, a household in Scripture forms when there's a conjugal union between a man and a woman. And we see that means that the very first social institution is the household. And it was established in the Garden of Eden. Okay, so it's the very first one. Before there's a federal government or a state government or your local city council or any of that kind of stuff, or before business corporations or nonprofit organizations, the very first institution is the household. So let me read the story of the institution of the first household. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." Now out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all the livestock and to the birds of the heavens and to every beast of the field. But for Adam, there was not found a helper fit for him. So the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up his place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." Now the idiom "one flesh" has been understood for time out of mind to mean the issue of children from the conjugal union of a man and a woman. So you say, one flesh, we have come together. So there's a linkage with the conjugal union, but then the issue of that union is a child, right? One flesh formed from the two. So, have you done those DNA analyses, where you go and, put a swab in your mouth and send it off, and you become part of some vast database. Who knows what's going to happen to this information? But anyway, I did that before I'd wised up about that kind of stuff. And so my wife and I both know a lot about our history. And what I told my kids is, you don't need to do that. Why? Because you already have the information. Mom and dad are the source material that made you. Now, if there's some different data that comes back, we got a problem. If you went about and did that, and you tell me, "No, Dad, something you need to know." Anyway, but obviously I'm tongue in cheek. But that's just the beginning. So it also meant a common life, a common wealth. That's why when a household is broken up, its assets are distributed to the people who are leaving the union. Common future, and for our purposes here, a common work. We're working together. So what happened? So I just described a lost world. It's largely lost on people today. They don't even think in these terms at all. We live in a world that has a visceral hatred, particularly for the father. And I think there's a reason for that. And the reason I noted is that passage in Ephesians. So there's a kind of intuition that we have about the connection between fathers and authority. And people don't want authority. They want to just be able to do what they want to do. So now how we lost it's actually pretty well known. I don't have to make anything up or tell you that I discovered stuff. I mean, this is stuff that you can learn just about anywhere if you care to look into it. Now, generally, we believe we've progressed, which is part of the propaganda that we have used to justify all of this stuff. Now, progress gave us the Industrial Revolution, but there was a revolution in thought that occurred before that. So the revolution in thought came first, and then the revolution with regard to the economy followed. And those revolutions drove productive work out of the house and into the workplace. Initially, whole families moved into the factories. So if you've ever seen those photographs of women with their daughters, next to those huge mechanical looms, and you thought, man, those nasty robber barons driving entire families or making children work, you got it completely backward. What actually happened was there was no place to put the kid during the day. And for time out of mind, daughters helped their mothers with all the things that the mother did. Likewise, the sons helped their fathers with everything that the father did. That's why the boys went into the mines. It wasn't like, I'm driving you into the mines. You go to work with Dad. That's the way it was. We had to develop public schools and other things to take care of kids when the parents were working someplace else. That took a while for that part of the story to get going. But before that, that's why we had child labor. It's because we've always had child labor. You've probably seen, Parks and Recreation where Ron Swanson says, child labor laws are ruining this country. When I was 11 years old, I was in charge of the factory floor. That kind of thing. There's a little bit of truth in that. There's a little bit, he's having fun, but there's a little bit of truth in that. Now, I'm not saying we should bring those days back. They were awful. I remember, like I noted earlier, many of my ancestors are from West Virginia, and I was in Fairmont at a camp, and in the camp they had like a meal hall, and they had photographs of the boys from the day. And those boys were, they looked like they could kill you. They were like 8 and 9 years old, but they had seen men die, and you could tell by the look in their eyes. And they provided important, they helped, because when you get down in the mines, there's some little places you can't get into as a full man, but you can send the boy in and say, go and tell me what's in there. And that's how they were involved with the work. But anyway, now the Industrial Revolution changed things in many ways for the better. There's no denying it. The upside, economies of scale, the division of labor, the harnessing of power that never could have occurred in the household economy gave us automobiles and air conditioning and antibiotics. And I want you to know I like those things, and I like to keep them. I like cars. I've got a few. I like antibiotics. I like air conditioning. I really like air conditioning. So, but, everything comes at a price, and we've lost some things in the process. Now, just so you know, I'm not making this all up. There's a friend of mine by the name of Alan Carlson, and he's a world-renowned authority on the history of the household. And he wrote a book entitled Family Cycles, Strength, Decline, and Renewal in American Domestic Life, 1630 to 2000. And this is what he wrote when it comes to the Industrial Revolution and what followed. In 1930, President Herbert Hoover created the President's Research Committee on Social Trends. Its 1933 report featured a chapter on family authored by University of Chicago sociologist William Ogburn. Now, Ogburn is still a big deal in sociology. He contrasted the old family system, which had been, quote, the chief economic institution, the factory of the time, the main education institution, end of quote, with a new order where, quote, the factory has displaced the family. Gone from the home were the array of activities that had defined the subsistence family economy: sewing, canning, baking, laundering, most cooking, healthcare, childcare, care of the elderly, security, education, amusement, recreation, and religious activities. All had passed or were passing to industrially organized entities, be they corporate, state, or charitable in nature. American homes, according to the report, were merely parking places for parents and children who spend their active hours elsewhere. So now you know that as early as 1933, the federal government considered your household a parking place, just where you go when you're not doing productive things. Now, in order to build this industrial economy, we had to deconstruct the household. And since that's where we live, we had to deconstruct ourselves. So deconstruction is not a new thing. To reach the heavens that we can see, we had to trade in the heavens we can't see. It's questions such as, is it good, or is it true, or is it beautiful, or what does God say? Were just kind of thrown away. They were considered irrelevant, maybe even oppressive. And the human form no longer informs us, since we'd rather it be without form and void so that we can turn ourselves into whatever we want. This is where we get transgenderism, but also transhumanism and all kinds of trans stuff. Because we now think of our bodies as just kind of silly putty, that we can just shape and stretch and mold into anything we like. But in the past, we looked to them for some wisdom and some instruction. What was I made for? Man would say, I was made for a wife. A woman would say, I was made for a husband. That was like just such common sense. Anyone who departed from that was just considered nuts. Maybe we should just bring that back and consider people like that nuts who can't see these obvious things. So now we spend our lives suspended in midair, cut off from God in our own bodies, carried along. And this is the thing that we don't reflect on enough. We're carried along by every wind of doctrine that comes from Wall Street or Harvard or Hollywood. We're just blown around by all this stuff. And we think that's freedom, being manipulated by these institutions that are on the other side of the planet. So, ironically, when the economy moved out of the house, some people thought it would be good for the family. That's a really weird way of thinking, but they thought that since households no longer served any practical purpose, marriage could focus on love and self-fulfillment, personal fulfillment. But what actually happened? What actually happened? Is that what happened? Well, there are unintended consequences. That's kind of one of the things that you should just always remember. There's what you intend, and then there's the consequences you don't intend. And there have been a lot of consequences that we've not intended. So let me just go ahead and list 5 unintended consequences. The first is marriage has been reduced to a lifestyle choice. Oh, you want to be married? Well, I guess that's great for people who are into that sort of thing. It used to be that we considered marriage like a fundamental institution that made our civilization possible. Now we think of it just as like, well, if you're into that, good for you. So it's just a matter of taste. And across the world, the average age of a person getting married continues to go up, even as the percentage of people getting married goes down. Martin Regnerus, who's a sociologist at the University of Texas, documented that in 1980, this is 1980, I remember that. I remember 1980. I was 18 years old in 1980. For me, it was like yesterday. For some of you, I know it's like ancient history. 1980, did they have cars then? That kind of thing. But in 1980, 91% of Czech women were married by the time they were 30 years old. 91%. Today, it's just 26%. And the trend is the same everywhere. In 1980, 81% of Australian women, 66% of Finnish women, 76% of Italian women, and 81% of Dutch women were married by the time they were 30. Today, it's between 20 and 30% in all those countries. And people are experimenting with marriage. I don't know if you noticed that. There's so-called gay marriage, which my friend Doug Wilson calls gay mirage. But anyway, that's almost passé. That's almost passé. I mean, if you're really hip, you're into polyamorous marriage or open marriage or marriage to vegetation. Have you seen this? I saw a report about a woman who married a tree. She married a tree. She said the tree was very dear to her, and she just couldn't imagine life without it, so she decided to marry the tree. I even heard of a woman who married a bridge, an inanimate object. At least the tree was alive. This woman married. Now, guys, we've got our turn. There are guys who are marrying their chatbots now. I don't know if you noticed that. And they're inflatable dolls. And it's good. It's just goofy everywhere. It's just goofy everywhere. And it's gross. And that's what the world has become. So marriage has been reduced. And then there are many churches that want to bless it all. Just like, hey, if you're into that, who's God to judge? Who's God to judge? God just approves of everything, right? He just loves you so much. You can just go ahead and jump off a cliff and he's good with it, that kind of thing. So we focus in many churches more on emotional satisfaction in marriage than on the tasks that marriage historically performed. And the old vows, which are the only vows I use. If someone comes to me and says, I want to get married, but I want to make up my own vows. I say, the Unitarians are right over there if you want to do that. That's what they do. They just kind of just give you whatever you want. I'm not going to do that. Now, the second unintended consequence is children are increasingly believed to be useless or even bad to have. Fertility is plummeting around the world. And this is greeted as something to celebrate by, guess who? Humanitarians. Isn't that interesting? We're humanitarians against humanity. Actually, in places like Portland, Oregon, where I live, there are people who actually talk that way. Now, we're starting to feel the effects finally. You can only have so much stupidity before you start to hurt yourself. And in Japan, for instance, the population declined by 449,000 people, in 2018, and it's been accelerating. Every year, the number has gone up. China lost 850,000 people in 2022, and there are reports that we think they're not telling us the full story, that it's actually much worse. The population is in huge free fall there. We don't really need to worry about China long term. They're just going away. Anyway, now everyone knows kids are expensive, right? So in 2017, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I don't know why the USDA did this, but they had a lot of money to spend, so they decided to investigate, I guess. They estimated that it would cost $233,610. I love that 10. They're really getting very specific. To raise a child to 17 years of age. Besides being expensive, kids hurt your feelings. Dogs, on the other hand, are less expensive, and they're always happy when you come home. I don't know if you've noticed that. And so people are trading in kids for pets, and this is really a major thing. It's everywhere. And even when people manage to have children, they treat them like pets. Things to lavish, upon, but not depend upon. And like a self-fulfilling prophecy, when these kids reach adulthood, you often can't depend on them, right? You never intended to depend on them. Why should you expect to depend on them when you need them? Because you didn't have that in mind from the start. Now, there's a popular book on marriage with thousands of five-star reviews, and it's by a celebrated author. In fact, it's entitled Marriage, and there's only one mention of children in the book. Like, how do you write a book on marriage and you only mention children once? Well, that was Tim Keller, and he figured out a way to do it. And now, third unintended consequence is post-familialism is on the rise. Post-familialism. So that means trying to think about, living a life without even family. Since marriage and children are believed to be more trouble than they're worth, people are just opting out of beginning a family at all. Something has emerged that would have been considered an absurdity in the ancient world, and that is the single-person household. I see it a lot in different places. I especially see it with middle-aged women who work for large corporations. Many of them are divorced. And since many of them have exchanged family for career, their social needs are met at work. That's just the way they think. So they work with their friends during the day and then go home to be with their cats. And rather than challenge this or even question it, some evangelicals, particularly in the coastal cities, justify it, citing 1 Corinthians 7 and Paul's comments about how much more freedom he had as an apostle to kind of go here and there and everywhere. So now everybody wants to be the Apostle Paul, but not actually do apostolic things. Unless you consider working for XYZ Corp Apostolic Ministry or something like that. So this is the situation we find ourselves in. Number 4, we're sliding into socialism. If you wondered what is kind of going on with this interest in socialism, with people in New York City with this commie Muslim that they're about to elect. What's going on with that? Well, a lot of them are the people I just described. These aren't poor people. In fact, if you go to New York and you actually ask people, who do you support, the actual working class people don't like that guy. They're not actually interested in supporting that guy. Who supports that guy? the people I just described. Highly educated young people who are frustrated because they don't make as much as, Bill Gates. I'm absolutely serious. They're filled with envy and resentment because there are people who have more power than they have, and so they're just going to wipe it all out. By the way, that's what happened with the Bolshevik Revolution. It also happened with Pol Pot in Cambodia. The people that you think were like these sort of champions of the working class were actually privileged people themselves who were frustrated because they weren't absolutely at the total top. They were like next level down people. You can read all about it in Eric Hoffer's The True Believer, marvelous study on the nature of totalitarianism. So they use essentially poor people as their front, as their justification for what they really are up to. I know these people personally, by the way. I'm not just picking on them. I lived in Cambridge for a decade. I went to Harvard. I know these people. I'm not making stuff up. They are nasty, nasty people. So, of course, what this does is it leads to childless people free-riding the system because the incentives encourage it. But in the long run, the situation is unsustainable. When the number of people who are drawing on the system is fewer than the people who are paying into the system, eventually things go bust. And finally, Christians are losing their ability to think and speak like Christians. The language of our faith is drawn largely from the productive household. Think about it. God the Father, the only begotten Son. And by the way, if he's the only begotten Son, guess who gets the inheritance? Him. Which means that you and I only have access to the inheritance through him. That's the logic. So if we want to be in Christ, we are joint heirs with Christ. If we are outside of Christ, we get nada, zilch, nothing. It's all his. That's the way it works. And the reason why some of you look at me quizzically is you don't hear about this very much, because this is the stuff of the Bible. A bride adorned for her husband. What's that? Who's that? That's the church. The bride adorned for her husband, which means that she inherits everything because she's married to the guy who gets everything, right? The marriage supper of the Lamb, that's the way the Bible ends, right? It ends with a wedding. Read Revelation 21 and 22. That's what it's about. So all these things are the faith, but we've lost touch with the things that help us understand the faith because we no longer live in the old way. And so Christianity, what do we have when we don't have households to live in any longer? I think we see it. Everything's reduced to a personal relationship with Jesus. Jesus is my personal buddy, and he lives in my heart, right? He's very portable. I can take him everywhere, kind of here and there and all kinds of places. So what do we do about this? Well, I think we need to do a couple of things, and I know I'm running out of time, but I'm going to be speaking again tomorrow on some of this. But I think we need to do the two things. We need to do what we can to recover the productive household. I think that's key. And then we need a transcendent point of reference. So 2 books I've written that address these themes. One is Man of the House, which is an argument for getting back to the productive household. And then Household and Worth for the Cosmos is about recovering a transcendent point of reference. But I'm going to talk more about things that you would find me writing about in Man of the House. So Man of the House is actually taking, I actually took a household manual, a manual for households from antiquity written by Xenophon called Oikonomikos. And it was famous in the ancient world. If they had Barnes & Noble in the ancient world, it'd be right where The Millionaire Next Door is and Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It'd be right there. Everybody was reading it. Everybody knew about it. It was translated by, if I remember correctly, either Cicero or Seneca. Everybody knew about it. And in that book, the protagonist is Socrates, just like with Plato's dialogues. Xenophon and Plato were contemporaries, and they both were students of Socrates, so that kind of gives you a little background on why. And what you have in that book is basically 2 people that Socrates interviews. And one is a total failure. He's grown up with a lot of wealth, and he's learning. He's just wasting it, and his household is in big trouble. And you got another guy who's like really got his act together and really knows how to manage a household well, and is regarded highly by everyone in the community. And so Socrates talks to the two guys and says, what's your secret? The second guy, what's your secret? How do you do things? And with the first guy, he's like, what's your problem? Why can't you realize that you're like ruining your life? But anyway, so those are the two characters that Socrates interviews. And one of the things that Socrates is interested in, very, very much interested in, is the relationship of these men with their wives. How does it work in your household? What's the relationship between you and your wife? All that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of really interesting things related to sort of practical matters. And one of the things that Xenophon really stresses is there's a natural division of labor between men and women. In other words, nature actually comes front-loaded with meaning, and if you're wise, you just learn. This is the way it's supposed to work, right? So you don't say we were just blank slates so we can do anything we want. No, there's design. So this is a pagan. I'm not even talking about a Christian. This is a pagan. And the goal in Xenophon is not independence, but interdependence. The husband and the wife should be so interdependent that they literally can't imagine life without each other. Think about that. So instead of the statement, I can't live without you. Instead of it just being like a greeting card thing, hey, honey, I got you this card. You would really mean it. You're like, you know what? If you're not around, I'm dead. Because I depend on you for really practical stuff, just the stuff of daily life. And that can really give you a lot of appreciation for a person if you're smart and you think about these things. So I'd like to reflect a little bit on my household and kind of end with that, because even though I wasn't raised in an environment like this, my wife and I, over the course of our marriage, have tried to pursue this, but kind of midstream, you could say. I really began to appreciate some of these things after we already had kids, so it's kind of like build the wagon while you ride it. We're trying to figure it out as we're going along. So I've learned some lessons. Now, one of the things that's worth noting about a pastor's household is it works on the old model. Think about it this way. Let's say you were looking for a pastor. I know Jared's going to be with you for the next 500 years, but let's just imagine that you need a new pastor, and so you're interviewing pastors. What do you ask? Well, the first question is always, where did you go to school, right? And tell us a little bit about your theological education, prep, and that kind of stuff. Then, you get into maybe some things related to what, other, churches have you served over the years, and how those situations go. But it's always the second or third question. Tell us about your wife. Tell us about your wife. When you go to interview at Staples over here, they don't ask you that question. It's that's none of their business, right? Your wife, if you have one, maybe you don't, But first of all, when you're a pastor, it's expected. You're going to have a wife, unless you're a Catholic priest, But, and in the old days, maybe maybe sometimes there were. But anyway, the idea is that it's understood that this is kind of what you look for in a pastor, because it's based on the old model. The pastor's home is pre-industrial revolution, even to this day. Let's say, I was being interviewed, and I said in response to that question, "What? That's not your business. I'm going to sue. That's not something that you're allowed to ask about. We all know, the labor laws and that kind of stuff. You're not supposed to discriminate based on, marital status, right? By the way, my wife's not even a Christian. She's an atheist. She'll never be here. Do I get the job? No." It's next, because it's based on the old model. So a parsonage is based on the old model. Husbands and wives work together, in the ministry. And their kids are supposed to work along with them. So when my kids were getting old enough to think for themselves, I just basically told them, you don't even think about not going to church. it's what we do. It's what we do. And not only that, you are expected to contribute. You're expected to contribute. You're expected, if there's like a need for something to be done, I expect you to be available. And if you're not, you are out of the house. No, no inheritance for you, no soup for you. But it just was. My kids never really thought to challenge it. It was just assumed we work together as a family. We do everything together. When it came to the ministry as a family. So, but there were other things that characterized our home that I think are worth talking about. So I'm an author and an illustrator and a traveling speaker. I was a college professor for a decade. And my wife is a piano teacher and an instructor, also a hairdresser. I actually married the gal who can do your hair. I haven't had to get a haircut but done by anyone else in like 43 years. She's always cut my hair. But so I had the beautician piano teacher. That's who I married. And our studios are in the home. So there's a part of, so I think like 55% of our house, the houses we've lived in are tax deductible. Literally, because they're workspace, right? So, so her work areas, my work areas. So this was always going on, but our house also worked as a kind of a skunk works for our kids. So my oldest son is an audio engineer. He works in Nashville. He works with musicians and stuff, like he's in the music industry. He's also the guy that produces our podcast, the Theology Podcast. So you might hear him mentioned every once in a while in the show. We did a documentary in Oxford, and my son was the producer for that. So if you've seen the documentary, he was the one that was behind that. But he got started at home. I remember when he was a kid. This was back in the days of Guitar Hero. Remember Guitar Hero, where everybody pretended they could play guitar, right? And my son just had this eureka moment. He's like, "Why not just learn to play the guitar?" And he did. And so now he can play everything. So like even the banjo that you hear at the beginning of the podcast is my son. So he's done a lot with that. And my second son got started at home too. Today he's a blacksmith and a steel worker and a furniture maker. But he got started in the garage. He built his first forge in the garage. Remember that episode in Parks and Recreation where the couple forgets their wedding rings and Ron Swanson has to make wedding rings out of a sconce on the wall? It's hilarious. He gets a waffle iron out and makes. Anyways, my second son did that, and not with the waffle iron, but he actually cast the wedding rings. He actually figured out how to do it and practiced and did that for. I remember he almost burned the house down a few times. There was a time he made it like a torch, like a real torch, like you see in the movies. And it was like, this thing is awesome, but get it out of the garage. Anyway, and then my daughter is sort of like the queen or the princess of like Etsy. She's got just all these things that she can do. If I showed you some of her handiwork, you'd just be, I've told her, what you need to do, sweetie, is you need to find like really wealthy old ladies who are willing to pay you like really top dollar for your work. But she's so, sort of like simple in sort of her way of thinking about things. I have to be the cunning one, So she bakes. She's a great baker. And she would, when she was in college, she would come home and just announce on social media, I'm home, and then the orders would just come in. And then like the whole time she was home, she was just in the kitchen, and people were coming to the house. And one of the times there was this boy who had a thing for her. And so he ordered all kinds of pastries and stuff like that, $100 worth of stuff. And then he gave her like a $100 tip. And then he left, and I said, sweetie, this is great. Let's see if we can lead this guy along for a while. She didn't like that idea. I mean, she's an honest girl and didn't want to like lead him on, but I was willing to just lead him on, drain him of his money, and crush him. But anyway. So, but I think the biggest thing that was a real influence on the kids was our commercial real estate. So, at one point we had 18 tenants and we had property. I've been a landlord since 1994. Working on stuff with my second son today. My second son, my oldest son, works with us on the podcast and that kind of stuff. My second son works on the real estate. So we've been working on a few things recently. We had to replace some boilers. So, as they were growing up, they always helped me because I would do a lot of the work myself because I've got a background in the trades. And sometimes, I'd bring in people to do stuff that was like above my pay grade, but most of the time it was me with the boys. And, sometimes I even paid them. But not always. Sometimes I just told them, someday this will all be yours. My vast estates. But I did tell them, I said, someday when you go to college and you go to trade school and that kind of stuff, this is what's going to pay for it. And it did. So they were working for that. And someday they'll get it, too. If everything goes well and someone doesn't sue my socks off, and it's still there, I always throw in those caveats, if it's still there, they'll be yours. So now that's productive property, and that's a household functioning in the old way. So we need to develop a kind of hybrid, a kind of realistic accommodation to the situation that we find ourselves in, but we should all be striving for productive property and getting our households working productively. And when you do it right, you have some stuff left over when you die, right? It's a good thing to give a child an inheritance. That's biblical. I don't know why we don't think in those terms anymore, but we don't. And so what we need to do is recover dynastic thinking, an ability to think multi-generationally. And by the way, I think we're going to be forced to do it. The kind of the world that we've lived in over the last, 70 years or so is going away. Easy, cheap money, it's going away. Low price, gone away. What we are getting back to is what people had to keep in mind forever, and that is, this is a multi-generational thing. We have to be thinking about, as parents, the welfare of our children and helping them get their households established, which means all kinds of things that I'll get into tomorrow. Anyway, thanks a lot. That's enough for now. I'm out of time.